let's start with a definition of digitalization under the CAP strategic plan. What is digitalization? We defined it in the report as the systematic use of infrastructure, technologies and tools, data and networks to improve economic, environmental performance, rural development, and at some extent, simplification. This definition has, let's say, 5 key domains. The first domain is about infrastructure and capabilities and skills. In the value chain, it maps very much to supportive operations, and to the Digital Decade program, it relates to digital infrastructure and digital skills. The second domain is smart production, on-farm operations, on-farm equipment, and of course, applications. It maps on the digital business cardinal point of the Decade program. And then on the market integration and knowledge networks is the third domain that relates to this definition. It is about upstream and downstream operations, so the connections between the farmers in rural areas and the outer world, let's say, or their peers. Again, it maps very well to digital businesses. Another domain is the sustainability and rural areas integration, so beyond the farming sector and more to the rural areas, but also to the effects of the farming to environmental and social issues. And finally, a domain which might not be very much supported by the CAP, but it is crucial for digitalization, is the data economy and innovation ecosystem. So how the data that are generated throughout the value chain can be shared between the actors and can produce value. And this relates to digital businesses and digital services. Based on these definitions, we have to identify which interventions under the CAP strategic plan can be related to digitalization. And we have already some tools for this, which are the result indicator, for example, the result indicator 3, which is for on-farm digitalization, I would say, investments on farm that relate to digitalization. There are also other result indicators, like, for example, the indicator on smart villages, which could be also relevant under specific conditions. But there are also some variables in the data for interventions and beneficiaries, the DIB, as, for example, the M200, which relates to broadband interventions and projects. But as I said before, these tools have a limited potential because they cannot capture every aspect of digitalization that can be found in the different interventions, but also in some cases, member states have not linked, let's say, an intervention to the result indicator R3, although there is a digitalization component in the intervention. For this reason, we tried to develop a classification system for labeling digitalization-related interventions in the report and through the work of the Thematic Working Group. This classification system consists of 5 domains, which are in line with the definition. These 5 domains are then broken down to 19 functional groups, which are actually different policy approaches and implementation strategies, which further break down into 36 specific activities, which can be used to precisely classify actual interventions. Let me say a few words about this classification system. So it starts with the digital foundation. The first domain is about the digital foundation, how infrastructure, skills, basic equipment are being adopted and implemented. Then moves to smart production through smart equipment on farm management information system, but also analytics of the data that are produced. And these two form the basis to, let's say, a more application-driven digitalization, which connects individuals or businesses to markets and peers through market integration and knowledge networks. And it goes also beyond agriculture to environmental and social sustainability integration. And finally, this is all underpinned by the data economy. The system shows this progressive complexity from basic infrastructure, basic equipment, basic skills, to more advanced equipment, more advanced analytics, more advanced need for skills development through connectivity, through networking, through market integration, through peer-to-peer learning. And also it has this separation between infrastructure and application. So you will see, for example, some equipment on variable rate applications or GIS driven equipment, but you will also see the applications that are built on this data that are collected, for example, from sensors or specialized equipment, and how this can be used in the cyber physical management system that Siak explained at the beginning. The system has a hierarchical logic, meaning that the more detailed information available, the more accurate the classification can be. I have here some examples. For example, if you see in the description of an intervention a general digitalization goal, like, for example, improving farm competitiveness through digital solutions, then you cannot go into a very detailed classification. And you may stay at the level of tier 1, at the domain stage. So here, for example, it could be a production-focused digitalization without implementation specifics and mapped to domain B of the smart production. If there are more information which mention general technology categories without specific implementation details, then you can classify the intervention according to tier 2, which are the functional groups. An example could be that an intervention mentions precision agriculture implementation. This could very well be classified under the functional group B1, which is specific for precision agriculture systems. But if there are specific information about technologies and implementation approaches, then you can go to the more specific tier 3 level of classification. For example, if you know the intervention mentions that GPS precision spraying equipment, for example, will be supported, then you can go and classify according to this very detailed level of classification. We try to avoid having other categories. If information that is available does not allow to classify under tier 3, as I said before, you don't have the necessary details to classify it under tier 3, you can use the closest tier 2 or tier 1 classification. So you will not find any other categories there. And of course, this classification system is not written in stone. You can adapt it to your needs. You can add, delete, change elements to make it tailored to your contexts and your needs. This is just an example of how a classification system could be developed and what could be included there. Let me show an example of the classification system. As I said before, the domain creates the essential conditions that make a sophisticated digital agriculture and integrated management possible. So domain sets the digital foundations and capabilities. For example, here, domain A. Then the functional groups provide the technology toolkit that every digitally enabled farm must possess to participate in digital agriculture and integrated management, and the same holds also for rural areas. For example, in this example here, the functional group could be basic technology and equipment. And then we go to the specific activity, computing hardware and software systems, which has these keywords. You may find them in Annex 1 of the report that help you classify. And these can be used to classify a specific intervention, which is found in Poland. It's the premiums for young farmers. And in the description, you see that it mentions investments related to the startup, shall include purchase of equipment, including hardware and software to support the production of unprocessed agricultural products or their preparation for sale. This intervention was not linked to R3, but in the description, you may find that it can be all mapped to the most detailed level of the classification and included into, let's say, an intervention logic for digitalization under the CAP strategic plans. And talking about the intervention logic, using the whole theoretical framework, using the analysis of the role of the CAP strategic plans and other policies in leveraging drivers and enablers to overcome barriers, and based on also the different technologies, tools, applications that have been described in the classification system, we can come up with a generic intervention logic. And this includes, of course, non-CAP support, which is very important and was mentioned before by Katerina, that maybe the CAP is not the main driver in many cases, because we have Digital Europe program, we have the next generation EU digitalization of businesses, we have cohesion policy, smart specialization strategies, Horizon projects, but also the European Space Agency services, which can support digitalization. But there is also CAP support, and this comes from, of course, skills, knowledge exchange, dissemination, European Innovation Partnership operational groups, and these map to specific functional groups of the classification system. You have also digital administrative services and market information, which are not in the CAP strategic plans, but are offered by DG Agri, let's say, digital information that is offered by DG Agri, and it is open, and it falls under functional group A5, which is by administrative issues and also activities of the data economy. You have in the CAP strategic plans now investments, startups, cooperation leader, eco schemes, environmental climate commitments, for example, for precision farming, and sectoral interventions. All these support contributes to a short-term income impact, which is the increased adoption and intensity of digitalization in agriculture and rural areas. And I say this is the first short-term impact because through all these interventions of the CAP, we support the adoption and the more intensity of digitalization, and actually this maps to cross-cutting objective. But once digitalization is adopted, then it leads to other higher level outcomes, like lowering administrative burden, like higher value products due to traceable attributes, reduction of inputs, improved access to services, and reduced digital divide. And these then contribute to higher level impacts, I would say, which is more sustainably productive agriculture, which can be mapped to specific objectives 2, 4, 5, and 6, but also more sustainable and inclusive growth in rural areas, which can be mapped to specific objective 8. This is the generic intervention logic. It is supported by the classification system. It is supported by the theoretical framework that Siak described before. Key takeaways. Existing indicators and variables have a limited potential to identify related interventions. The classification system can help to better understand the process of digitalization and identify interventions. Feel free to adopt it to your contexts. Several funding sources outside the CAP, of course, support digitalization, play a significant role and must be taken into account into any assessment. And of course, a dual role for the CAP: contribute to fostering digitalization, the cross-cutting objective, and then once the digitalization is adopted, it contributes towards increasing sustainable productivity and promotes sustainable and inclusive growth in rural areas, contributing to the corresponding specific objectives. So moving on to assessing the contribution of the CAP strategic plans to fostering digitalization, it is about this short-term impact that I described in the intervention logic. Let me start with an example of an evaluation framework. The evaluation question could be: to what extent have CAP strategic plans promoted the digitalization of agriculture in rural areas? And it can be approached by structuring the evaluation around factors of success that relate to the digital decade cardinal points. For example, here, the first factor of success could be digital infrastructure and connectivity are improving due to CAP support. The indicator would be what's the rural population with broadband coverage, speed and quality due to the CAP support. A data source which could be the broadband coverage in Europe 2024. And the good thing is that you have also a benchmark to compare how effective the CAP has been into contributing to the improvement towards the digital decade connectivity target. There is a specific target in the digital decade program of coverage of rural areas with broadband infrastructure, and you can say what's the magnitude of the effect of the CAP support by comparing the contribution of the CAP to this already defined objective. The same holds for digital skills, which is another cardinal point. There is again there a benchmark or a target that can be used to assess the effectiveness of CAP support to improving digital skills in rural areas. Indicator rural population participating in digital skills development supported by the CAP. You have the DESI indicator and the DESI dashboard, which shows the percentage of adults with at least basic digital skills, and you can see what is the contribution of the CAP towards this factor of success and this target. The same can be used for the third cardinal point about digital business transformation and how it is facilitated due to CAP support. There are some also digital decade targets, but the target there is mostly for rural enterprises, and agriculture is not considered there. So national data from the annual survey of ICT users in enterprises could be perhaps used, but most importantly, ad hoc surveys addressed to farmers might be necessary if you want to see what's the transformation of the rural, of the agri-food sector, and what's the adoption in the intensity of digitalization for farmers. So here, there might be a connection to the cardinal point, but of course, it must be tailored to the agri-food sector better, and ad hoc surveys are necessary. For digital public services, the digital decades, the target may not be available. It describes very, very key government services to be digitalized. But again, here it can be tailored to the situation in rural areas, and evaluators can check for relevant targets set at the national level or compare the situation before and after the implementation of the policy, looking at rural population benefiting from digital services supported by the CAP and data from the operations database. A very important aspect in assessing the role of the CAP to promote digitalization is digitalization intensity. That is, move beyond adoption, beyond what technologies and tools are being used, towards the intensity of their use, how well and how extensively they are being utilized in the farming sector and in rural areas. There are several frameworks that can be looked at by the evaluators in order to understand how to assess intensity of digitalization. OECD has a quantitative framework which covers all sectors. It's for an evidence-based understanding of digital transformation patterns across the economy. It's not only for agriculture, it's for all sectors. Eurostat has also a quantitative digital index, covers all sectors. It's related to individual firm digital capabilities, and it benchmarks general business digitalization across different sectors. JRC also has developed a qualitative questionnaire that covers again all sectors, and it is based mostly on digitalization maturity. It is addressed to SMEs, mid-caps and public sector organizations to monitor the effectiveness of European digital innovation hubs and track progress towards the digital decade. Especially for the agri-food sector, Hagen and Wilkins have produced a qualitative diagnostic framework which is farm specific. It can be used as a diagnostic tool for individual farm self-assessment. So there is a range of tools there which can be used to understand what is digitalization intensity and how it can be measured. Key considerations for digitalization intensity and some tools and methods. Of course, it needs a multidimensional approach to capture adoption, utilization, sophistication, and how it is integrated into the organization of farms and rural businesses. Look beyond simple adoption to long-term digital transformation. Of course, human capital is the most critical component, and to measure competencies for sophisticated user and future adaptation is crucial. And of course, contextual characteristics to look for systematic differences between small and large enterprises, and to develop size-appropriate assessment criteria. So digitalization intensity is not the same for everyone. Some tools, the classification system and the progressive complexity framework can be a basis for this. The Farm Sustainability Data Network and its expansion to include innovation and digitalization data at the farm level can also be used to understand what kind of tools and what is the effect maybe of the use of these tools in the operations of the farms, but also dedicated ad hoc surveys are most appropriate to understand the breadth of adoption and the depth of users and operational integration of digitalization. Some key takeaways for assessing the fostering of digitalization through the CAP support. Ad hoc surveys may be needed to assess the CAP contribution towards this objective. The digital decade targets can be useful benchmarks, although for some cardinal points, evaluators may have to look for other targets and also, again, for the specific data that might need primary data collection. Always try to assess digitalization intensity beyond simple adoption of digital technologies and tools to understand the potential for transformation of digitalization in the agri-food sector and rural businesses.